Many of you here. I want to second Anne's welcome to everybody. This is a topic that got our, when we were discussing it, got a lot of robust discussion within our planning group, and we're excited to share it with you today. Many of us have been involved in some way in clean water plantings of some kind. And I invite you now to just picture in your mind one of those for you, something that's been growing for a while. And so first of all, think about it when it was first planted new and you had a plan in place and you had this plant goes here, this plant goes there, and they were small and just growing and you mulched around it, whatever. And and it was fairly controlled and you created something or helped create something, and there it was. Now think of it several years down the road. Some plants did really well, some didn't, some moved around, things have grown. It doesn't quite look the same. For some of us who have an aesthetic for the wild, it's just getting wilder and richer. For other people, it's like out of control. There are a lot of values and attitudes that people have around plantings and around what is natural and what is aesthetically pleasing. All of these thoughts feed into maintaining plantings once we go down the road and as the years go by. And today we are going to, and these could be anything, rain gardens, shoreline management thing, boulevards, even just natural lands that we're leaving natural or trying to manage in a more natural state. And today we are going to hear from two groups who do a lot considering this aspect of what do we do? What does supporting long-term care of natural landscapes and clean water projects really mean? We are going to hear from Angie Hong, who is the East Metro Water Resource Education Director of Programming. And she's going to talk to us about the lessons that they've learned from shoreline landowners in the Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District with some insights there. And she'll speak first, and then we will go to Jen Ehlert. Jen works with Metro Blooms. She is vice president of the Metro Blooms Design and Build aspect of that organization and co-director of design. She's a landscape architect. And she'll talk to us about their maintenance programs. They have a training program for maintenance teams that's a pathway into water related careers, and they've just done a lot of thinking about this. And I invite you, while you're listening, to think about what if you're dealing with the public, what sort of training, advice, insights do you give to someone who is envisioning a certain kind of planting and then the idea of it evolving and becoming, and how they might maintain that. After we're done listening to these two inspiring speakers, we will break out into our own breakout rooms and share some of our own experiences, and then come back and share just in the large group some of the things that we discovered. So Angie, I invite you to start out. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okie dokie. There we go. Is everybody seeing the presentation view and not my speaker view? Excellent. Okay, so this is our moment of Zen. Butterflies and flowers and open water, and it's not brown and dreary. So this is a little bit about a survey and focus group research project that we did in the spring of 2023 in the Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed, which is in northeastern Washington County. And just one kind of interesting note is that I am pretty sure that Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District was the first watershed district to offer cost share grants or to create a cost share grant program. And this actually even predated me. I started my job in 2006, and I believe that they started their cost share grant program somewhere around 2003 or 2004. And worked with a number of shoreline landowners to do shoreline restoration projects. And then, of course, there's a lot of shoreline landowners that just have natural shorelines that have never been altered. So that's just a little bit of a preface there. And um, want to talk about why the shorelines in particular are such a big issue. We have a newly formed natural shorelines partnership in Minnesota, and they have noted that Minnesota statewide has lost about 40 to 50% of our natural shorelines. And not only that, but natural shorelines continue to be lost at a rate of about 1 to 2% per decade. And as you might imagine, this loss of natural shorelines, when we go from a shoreline that looks like this to one that looks like this, we have this huge loss of biodiversity. And so in a lot of the lakes in our area, for example, we've been working really, really hard at doing stormwater runoff management in order to get rid of those phosphorus impairments, and we've succeeded. And we delisted lakes, and then no sooner did we delist the lakes than they got relisted for loss of biodiversity. So we have in our area new impairments on Lake Jane and Bone Lake, and then 8 lakes in the Chisago chain of lakes. And then we've got Big Carnelian and Big Marine, which are 2 of the cleanest, clearest lakes in the Twin Cities metro area that kind of got added to this watch list. So the PCA is saying, if you don't do something, dramatically different, these lakes are going to get listed as impaired for biodiversity loss as well. So this is a really, really big focus of our partners, especially in Northern Washington and Southern Chisago County. And just pictures, pictures of all the kinds of things we're talking about when we're talking about biodiversity loss. In the spring of 2023, we put together a mailed survey that was sent out to 565 shoreline landowners on 10 priority lakes in the Carnelian Marine St. Croix watershed. We had 144 people respond, so it was a really good response rate, around 25% of the people who received the survey. And we were asking people to share their values and concerns related to shoreline living, self-report on the characteristics of their property. And we also had inserted some questions in there geared at trying to gauge their knowledge about watershed issues and the watershed district in general. And then for Big Carnelian and Big Marine, since those were the 2 priority lakes for the watershed district, we did also do focus group sessions as well that were in person. And just to, kind of show you where some of these different lakes are and the varying response rates. So like Goose Lake is a pretty small lake that's up in northern Scandia, but we had 50% of the people on Goose Lake respond to the survey. So that kind of gives us an indication that people on Goose Lake are really engaged. Whereas you look at Big Carnelian, which is one of the target lakes for the watershed district, and only 20% of people responded. So people a little less engaged on that lake. As you probably would not be surprised, people's values include clean water, healthy ecosystems, being able to see the lake, boating, and having room to recreate with friends and family. What was a little bit more interesting were some of the comments that we got during these focus group sessions when we were asking people what initially drew you to living on these lakes. And people are really cued into the fact that these are renowned as clean lakes. People talked a lot about the fact that they compared different lakes in the area, and they were specifically looking for ones that were deep with clear water, ones that still looked natural and weren't developed around the shoreline, ones that had that kind of up north feel to them, but then also wanting to be close enough to schools and churches and their jobs. So a lot of people saying things like, I want it to feel like I'm up north, but not having to drive so far. And even people saying, I've been fishing on this lake for 25 years and I finally was able to move here 5 years ago. So people's relationship with the lake might even predate when they were able to finally afford to buy a lake house. In terms of concerns, and this really jives with my personal experience, that when we talk to lakeshore landowners in particular, the invasive species are always the #1 thing that they talk about. And I've always found it really challenging to actually even engage them about shoreline landscaping because they're so single-mindedly focused on invasive species. And even when we talk about terrestrial, it's terrestrial invasive species. So those are their two top concerns: algae, shoreline erosion. Not catching as many fish on Big Carnelian was a place where they had noticed that. And then, we asked them, well, how did you feel when you learned that your lake is impaired for declining biodiversity? Because we have done some outreach to people and we're trying to figure out, first of all, did they even know that? Did they pick up on the outreach we did? And also, are they surprised? And people aren't. They said, we're noticing this. We're not catching as many fish as we used to. They're smaller. They don't look healthy. I always love it when people say things like this. When I first moved here, there were so many fish, you could almost walk across the lake on their backs. There used to be tons of otters. I was able to go out on my property, see them all over the beach lying on their backs. I just want to interject that I have never once in my life seen an otter in Minnesota, and I am just enraged with jealousy anytime people tell me about seeing otters in our area. You only go fishing, and you only catch little ones that are a foot long and skinny. So people are on the lake and they're fishing and they're interacting with nature and they are noticing these changes. And then they're asking, but are we still good, because there's the Minnesota exceptionalism. Are we still good compared to other people? We still want our lake to be one of the best lakes. So then we also asked people to self-report on what is on their shoreline. And we used that same format that they use in the DNR Score Your Shore. And so you can see that in the self-reported mailed survey, people are saying, oh, like there's an average of maybe 67% unmowed natural vegetation in this upland shoreland area, 77% unmowed or natural vegetation on the shoreline, 50% having aquatic vegetation in that aquatic area. However, one of the things that I thought was really notable is that across all lakes, people reported having little to no shrubs anywhere. Like shrubs are just no go. And then when you compare that with, in this study, the Watershed District and WCD staff actually went out and were doing surveys from boats on the lakes. And the actual Score Your Shore results showed that less than 28% of the properties had at least 50% of their shoreline and natural vegetation. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy between what people think they have and what our professional staff see that they actually have. And just down here, let's see, you can see these are two neighboring properties. This one and this one show a really good example of like, this is what we're looking for, with native vegetation still intact. This is what we're not looking for when we've just got a big pile of rock riprap and lawn. And then just a little bit more about, what is actually on the property based on what our staff were seeing. Like, yes, trees, not very much natural buffers, definitely not very much of shrubs. So just seeing, a lot of heavy development in the shoreline areas. I don't need to go through in detail every one of these, but I'm just going to kind of click through real quick to maybe highlight a couple. One of the things I thought was interesting is that 35% of the survey respondents said that they have rain gardens. And I doubt that 35% of the people in the Watershed District have rain gardens. So this probably indicates a little bit of survey response bias. But it was interesting to me that many people have participated in the rain garden program. 40% of people saying they're interested in working with the Watershed District to improve their shoreline habitat, and another 38% saying they might be. So those are pretty good percentages to me. We've got 3/4 of people saying either yes or maybe yes. And people on Big Carnelian, which is one of the target lakes, were slightly more likely to want to work with people. And people were interested in the free site visits, the cost share grants, and the landscape design templates, which is great because those are things that we're already doing. And so it's good to get the confirmation that they want those things and they like those things. Just a note that when we did our focus groups with big carnelian and big marine lakes, people talked a lot about boat traffic and wake boats. And so there was this really, you know, it's definitely a dynamic that the watershed district is only able to control things related to like the shoreline landscaping. But people are like, yeah, but there's all these other things that are happening on the lake. And, they would maybe be frustrated because they'd worked with the watershed district on a shoreline restoration project and then it got, ruined by high water, lots of waves and wake action or ice heaves. So, people saying we want to have a holistic approach. We want you all to work together and think about these things together so that we're not doing one thing over here and then counteracting the improvements that we're doing over here. In terms of the native shoreline restoration projects that people have done or that they've seen done in their area, um, they kind of got a lukewarm response. Like people really did not seem super impressed with how well these shoreline restoration projects have held up over time. So people were saying things like, I've seen the watershed district do this in the past, but it seems like those shoreline restoration projects don't look very good anymore, or they've been taken over by invasive plants. People saying things like, because of the high water levels and the wake action, trees were falling down. Or the BMP program was well intentioned, but it doesn't seem like it was well executed because there hasn't been the follow up to help owners maintain their properties. And especially when you have property turnover and new people coming in, and maybe they weren't the ones who did the shoreline landscaping project. And so they're just buying into this property, not knowing that that was an intentional project. And then, like I said, the big boats, big problems. So lots of care and concern about wake boats and the wave action. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up with a couple of recommendations that we provided to the watershed district, and I think are probably relevant to any of us who are doing outreach to shoreline landowners. One thing that I noted is that we maybe need to change the way we talk about shoreline restoration projects to include trees, shrubs, and aquatic plants, because I realize that I myself, when I show photos, am almost always showing photos like that first opening slide where it's lots of beautiful flowers and there's a butterfly. And I'm not showing photos like this, where it is trees and shrubs and aquatic plants in the water. And really, this is perhaps even better habitat than the one in the beginning of the presentation. So, trying to use more photos and images like this that show like, this is what we really need it to look like. Like it actually needs to look like a habitat and an ecosystem and not just a pretty garden that happens to be next to the water. People do want to preserve biodiversity. They do care about wildlife. And so important to incorporate those as educational messages and, really focusing on what people can do that will promote clean water and healthy ecosystems. Considered a modified approach to native shoreline restoration projects. I like to show, this is actually the back view of that one that I just showed 2 slides ago. So this is like looking from the house down to the water. We've talked for a while about, how people want to see the water. They want to have access to the water. I think a lot of times we've used low maintenance as a selling point, and based on our survey and focus group responses, that's not really resonating with this crowd. And I don't want to like put such a fine point on it, but people who own shoreline property are very wealthy. And I think a lot of them, it's like, they can afford to hire out whatever kind of landscaping contracting they need to have. And they're kind of keeping up with the Joneses. So having this like low maintenance, cheap landscape is not actually a motivating factor for this particular crowd. Continue to offer incentive and technical assistance programs, especially the free site visits, the cost share grants, the landscape design templates. And then really thinking about working in partnership when we're doing our outreach and education, because like I said, people were very interested in having a holistic approach to these topics and not just working with one organization on this and a different organization on that. Okay, so there you go. This is my contact info, and I'll just kind of pause as it's sitting there in case anybody needed to write it down. We do have the full survey report on our website. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about rain gardens and native plantings then.
Okay, I tried your trick, Angie, for getting it to show right up. I don't think it quite worked, but can you all see my screen now and see the presentation?
Now.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. That was a great presentation, Angie. And there's a couple of things in there that I think will really relate to what we're talking about. So I'm excited to do that. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. My co-presenter, Ab, who was originally going to be presenting with me, isn't feeling well. So I'm going to do my best to present their portions. And if anybody has questions that I can't answer, I'm happy to take those and, you know, get back to you after I talk to Ab about some of those. But I think we'll be all good. I think a lot of you are familiar with Metro Blooms, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this particular slide. You know, Metro Blooms is our general nonprofit. We have our mission here to partner with communities to create resilient landscapes and foster clean watersheds, embracing the values of equity and inclusion to solve environmental challenges. And we do that through lots of different ways, including our land care, which we'll primarily talk about today. But just to give you kind of a little background, Metro Blooms Design Build is our for-profit. The sole partner in that is Metro Blooms, and that's who I work for, is Design Build, and that houses our like design, installation, and land care teams. And then of course we partner all the way across the board with our Blue Thumb education portion of the work that we do. So if you have any other questions about Metro Blooms, happy to kind of answer those as we go along. Make sure this is moving along. There we go. Some of the general program areas. Oh, sorry for that little mess up with the word installation there, but our general program areas include our workshops in our education program that's under Blue Thumb, our community engagement work with Metro Blooms, really working with communities to ensure that clean water funding is spent equitably in our areas here, and then our design and installation team. So we're designing, installing new, usually clean water focus, so rain garden or native plantings, and then our land care and maintenance. We use land care a lot because we really want to kind of, I feel like, move away from maintenance. Sounds kind of like drudgery, and so really start to think about the perception of this as doing some land care. And so you'll hear me use that word a lot, and they're really used interchangeably in our work. I'm going to talk first about some residential maintenance trends that we're experiencing, then I'll talk a little bit about commercial land care. So we have our land care team primarily performs commercial scale land care, so that's usually on like much larger rain gardens, but our designers also consult with residents a lot about maintenance programs and maintenance challenges. So we have some of those resources that we're going to share, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of trends that we're seeing in commercial scale rain garden and native planting and vegetation land care, and some of those challenges there, and a little bit about what that looks like. This is Ab, so to give them some recognition, here's Ab doing some of the great work that we do in vegetated landscapes. So in terms of residential maintenance, I know there were some studies recently, a little bit about that, which is so fascinating. We help residents in a couple of different ways. So in our work, interfacing with residents who are doing land care may look like an individual who simply has either a native garden or a rain garden, and they're interested in land care resources at the very beginning and then after the fact. And then I think that, as Kristen put it in the beginning of the presentation, you know, your garden really changes over time. So what does that look like after several years? You may be trying to reestablish the diversity because you have a particular plant that's really happy there, or you may have not paid a ton of attention to it and you realize you have a lot of weeds to remove. Kind of what does that look like? We've tried to meet that need by providing maintenance consultations. So that's where we actually work with a resident at their house for a small period of time, because we don't provide regular residential maintenance. We'll actually just work with them and really help them learn about how to maintain their own garden. So spending some time with them, pulling weeds, identifying natives, so that they have that experience and also feel that empowerment of how to do that on their own, and don't feel kind of like when you go to get your car fixed and you're not really sure, what's wrong with it. They have a little bit of a better understanding of how to do that in their yard. On the next slide, I'll show you some of the resources that we provide also. We've also tried to provide those maintenance consultations through our neighborhood projects. So we are partnered with both cities and neighborhood organizations to help their residents install small rain gardens. And now, as part of those programs, they are often offering subsidized or like cost share maintenance consultations. So residents who have had a rain garden for a number of years and have some questions, or find that they have some bare spots, they get a consultation, and then also have assistance from us in picking the correct plants for those bare spots, and then sourcing that material. Another trend that we're seeing is that we're really talking a lot about establishment requirements, and what Angie was saying about low maintenance landscapes really resonates. Oftentimes, a lot of people will come to us and say, look, I want a native garden or a rain garden. I want a really low maintenance landscape. And that gives me a little bit of pause, because it takes a lot to establish a native planting. And I really try to discourage them from thinking of this as a low maintenance landscape, because I think that in those cases, people tend to feel like they don't need as much care to water or to weed, especially during the establishment phase. So something that we are really focused on, I think, in our presentations, in our consultations with individual residents, whether it's part of a neighborhood project or not. So we're really talking about establishment of new vegetation. That has been fairly difficult in the past couple of dry summers, and you'll see some more images of how that's affected some of our larger vegetated landscapes. But that's something that's really important in order to kind of set the stage for having a well-maintained garden later on, is that establishment phase. And so I feel like that and trying to remove the perception that native plantings are a low maintenance landscape, I think is something I would like to move forward with, because I do feel like it takes amount of time and care to get a new planting established, whether it's a native planting or not. And I want to make sure folks are prepared to do that before they start to enter into these types of changes in their yard, ultimately, so they won't be disappointed with the response and the result later on. That's something I think about a lot, actually. So some of our online resources that we're really trying to focus on is we developed a plant care guide. Anyone we install a garden for, and I think that's also available on our the Blue Thumb website. We try to write it in a very conversational way, right? So like, it's okay if this happens, just because I think that having a guide that is written in a conversational way, I think can help people relate to what that land care might look like. Like, you can water with a sprinkler, that's fine. Just make sure it covers the entire planting so that it feels accessible to a lot of people. And then really helping people understand, you don't always have to identify the native plantings in your garden. What's really helpful is if you can identify the weeds, and then you know what you need to remove. The rest, you can think, okay, that's probably pretty good to go. So this is the best weed identifying book in our area. I think that's really helpful. And then of course our bluethumb.org has just a ton of online resources also that talk about that perception of what a native garden can look like. So we have our amazing community relations team has created a number of handouts to sort of explain, like, this native garden may look different from a traditional garden, and here's why. The one thing we tried to do there is to also ensure that it explains what a well-maintained native garden can look like, and so that if you just leave an area to go to seed and become weedy, that doesn't necessarily represent native habitat, especially given the number of invasive species in our area. So trying to make that distinction is pretty important. So some online resources there. I would be happy to put that link into the chat when I finish the presentation. I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about our land care program and what that looks like. So what we're seeing when we're doing land care of larger landscapes. So that's really our commercial landscape maintenance. We're going to talk a little bit about some of our vegetation management, kind of like trends and challenges, a little bit about inlet and pretreatment. I think talking about pretreatment is really fascinating, although not everybody feels that way. A little bit about what it takes to do some infrastructure repair, and then of course about our sustainable land care training program and what that looks like, and how we're trying to address some of the needs for ongoing land care in our areas. So these are just a few examples of some of the types of sites that we maintain. They could be larger BMPs that are accepting runoff from a large multifamily residence, like you can see in the top left. Or at a lot of our schools, at the bottom left, that's really either taking parking lot or roof runoff that's then transmitted to that rain garden. And then even curb cut rain gardens, like you can see here on the right. So it's kind of the scale of landscape and land care maintenance that we're talking about that our team often does, partnering with both cities, school districts, and other commercial partners. So this is an example of a site in the city of Champlin that we have been maintaining over time for quite a while. So just showing you a little bit about kind of what that looks like over time, and kind of what those land care activities entail. So what is that, earlier in the season, things are starting to green up. It's a great opportunity to actually wait until then to cut back some of that vegetated material or the duff from the previous year. So we know that pollinators are living in that. So waiting until the spring to cut that back. Midsummer, man, those weeds, as much, they come up fast, and we want to make sure that we've got our native vegetation has the ability to thrive, despite that weed pressure, or removing that weed pressure. This particular garden is well established, but actually over time had some changes from like a new sidewalk going in. So some new disturbances just from nearby construction really impacted it. And at this point, we're feeling really good about the vegetation is mostly reestablished. So then in August, of course, we've got a very full garden. We've had some space for some of the natives to fill in the bare spots, and then really looking at what are we pulling out of these gardens. A lot of weedy trees. So I would say our team pulls out more weedy trees than probably anything else as like a category. So kind of thinking about the type of care, and that's about how many times we would visit this site over the course of a season. So it's not forwarding. Give me a second. Okay, there we go. And just also thinking about some of the challenges that we're currently dealing with are some environmental factors. So this is the same rain garden. This is capturing runoff from Justice Page Middle School, which is in the city of Minneapolis. And so in 2022, we did have a dry year then as well. And the garden was starting to suffer. We could see this. This was in August. That's the picture on the left. And that garden has a lot of pressure also from kids just running in it, or just like little tiny feet. Actually, they're in middle school. Their feet get a little bit bigger then, so it's even worse. But then in October of this past year, we really saw this garden suffer. So we were really seeing a change in the plant material. So a number of dogwoods had completely died off. It was not getting enough moisture, not getting enough rain. A lot of Joe Pye weed also had died off. So we're really seeing the species that wanted wetter soils to die back, and now we need to do some adaptations to ensure that this garden can continue to thrive despite these environmental factors. And these are gardens that don't have the opportunity for a lot of supplemental water like a lot of residential gardens do. So we're really trying to establish them without additional water during the establishment phase. So that's a challenge I'd say we're currently facing in establishing vegetation. And then just also thinking a little bit about larger storm events and what that looks like. So we know that what has happened in the past couple of years is that we don't get a lot of rain, and then we get a really big rainfall. And we're seeing that impact on the sediment that is we're finding in pretreatment structures, and inlets. So those large flushes really quickly, and sometimes our pretreatment structures aren't able to handle such a large flush, and we're getting a lot more removal of sediment, trash, things like that. in pretreatment structures and in inlet structures because of those like heavy, quick rain events, especially when you haven't had rain for something like a month. And that just goes to show the importance of like sweeping, parking lot sweeping, to help remove some of that material prior to it entering that BMP, and then even vacuuming out catch basins and storm structures in order to handle that increase of sediment in those structures. So a trend we're kind of focused on right now. That was our before and after, of course, of an inlet. And then just really trying to focus on some routine maintenance so that regular care can help prevent that resuspension of solids within the pretreatment structure. So on the left, a site that hadn't been kind of maintained for a while, you know, there had been a lot of sedimentation of a rock swale. The pretreatment structure needed cleaning. And so we rebuilt that, and having kind of regular boots on the ground, eyes on pretreatment structures can help keep those cleaned out so that we're not seeing such a resuspension of solids in those really big storm events, especially for shallow pretreatment structures. Sorry, my computer is slow to advance my slides. Give me just a second. There we go. And then just a little bit about reconstruction. So this, again, is a site in Champlin. We're on the left in our high snow year, obviously not this winter, but the previous winter. We saw some snowplow damage at one of the rain gardens that's adjacent to a parking lot. This is a sheet flow. So actually there's no curb on that parking that you see. If you're looking at the left-hand picture, water just sheet flows into this rain garden. And then due to some heavy snow plowing, really gouged out that edge, and we were concerned about erosion as that runoff sheet flows into this rain garden. So by having kind of regular eyes on this rain garden, we reestablished that edge with some rock armoring to get that erosion or that eroded area stabilized, and then both spread seed and then kind of moved some of the existing plantings around our native plantings so that we could allow them to fill in. By the end of the year on the right, we really saw those native plantings fill in around that, and we'd been coming back all summer. So I think that regular kind of like reporting and record keeping helped us focus on how well this was reestablishing. Was the effort that we put in to help the erosion working, and how well was it working? So really keeping an eye on that. And sometimes a garden, you know, has some kind of construction or and we need to be able to reestablish that. And then finally, it's really fun to highlight the importance of all this vegetated maintenance, because what do we really get from that? We get a lot of really great native habitat. And these are all pictures that were taken specifically from our land care crews at sites that they maintain. So we're seeing so many, you know, great pollinators. We're seeing a lot of great vegetation establishment. So while we do have challenges, sites that are getting regular maintenance are really flourishing. And it's really fun to kind of focus on the why behind doing a lot of this work, and great to, you know, be rewarded and to see that. We have we use Slack on our teams to be able to communicate during the day, and always really enjoy when our crews are out there posting photos of what they're seeing, all the fun stuff, duck egg nests in rain gardens, just like really great. And so it's really rewarding, and just refocusing on kind of the habitat that we're creating for pollinators and why we're doing all that work. And then finally, just a little bit about our sustainable land care training program. We piloted this program really this year, working with the city of Minneapolis to ensure that local residents are really the first to benefit from these green infrastructure improvements. And so what we're doing is training participants to be able to both do inspections and reporting, and then also participate in land care activities. That's a focus with BIPOC and low-income communities, ensuring, you know, training and job opportunities in this area. There is a need for land care. I think we all know that's a big challenge in getting BMPs established, and we really want to be able to help meet that market, whatever that looks like, you know, statewide, to help ensure that there's expertise in the area of land care, so that folks can both have career opportunities, and then our BMPs can be well maintained. Of course, if there's further questions about that, Laura from our office is here, and then we've worked with the city of Minneapolis and Ms. Sharam are here, and, you know, can also help answer some questions. And we had a really great training this fall we're actually participants in our land care program. We're leading a training discussion with Minneapolis staff, and it's great to see them kind of take those leadership roles. So it's also really exciting. And we're excited to continue that program this year and years to come, so that it's something we're still growing within our organization. I don't have my contact info up here like Angie did. That was a great idea, Angie, but I will stick that into the chat as soon as we finish the presentation. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you to you both. This is excellent. Lots of food for thought. And I'm hoping that it sparked a lot of connecting points in all of your imaginations, and you're thinking about your own projects, the own areas that you're working in, and some of the new terminology that we're working with, and the insights that we've gained from both Angie and Jen. We are, I believe, Ann, you're going to assign people to breakout rooms, right? So you'll be automatically assigned. Oh, here, I have a question for Jen. Oh, question time. I think we'll do that, Nick, at the end. We'll hold on to that and do that after we've broken out. Right now, you're going to be assigned to a breakout room, and there are 3 questions that we are going to suggest that you think about, and they're going to be in the chat, so you can take a look at those. And we're not going to say someone needs to write down everything that you're saying and report back. We're going to come back into the room. We're going to just offer some of our insights and thoughts at that point as kind of a bigger group discussion. So we'd like you to share with each other, how are you approaching and supporting rain garden and native planting project land care in your area? What kinds of trends are you observing? Do they align with what we've heard today or not, or you have other observations? And is there a need for continued education and advice for aging planting projects? So think of those and go off and have a lovely discussion. Share who you are with each other too. That would be great. See you in a little bit. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some interesting conversation. I want to hear what your thoughts were. I'm going to lead off though with Nick's question, just because I don't want to miss it in the end. So Nick, did you want to ask Jen your question, and then we'll do some sharing?
Sure, thanks. We were in the same breakout group, so we actually had a neat discussion that I think relates. So I'm asking about, historical prairie, and, are we trying to mimic historical micro prairie and create that dynamic, or the garden, and then our framing education follows from what we're trying to do. But Jen was talking about matrix planting, and I think it sounds like that kind of mimics a historical function of a prairie, and how forbs and grasses interact. And I thought that was neat. Anything to add, Jen?
Could you guys say more about matrix planting and what that is?
Yeah, we were talking about just like maintenance. So yes, we'd had a big discussion. It was great. And we were in the context of maintenance challenges. So ensuring that whether this is like a church rain garden or residential or commercial, that the folks who are maintaining it have the ability to like identify plantings and pull, you know, weeds and know what they're planting. So we talked about big block plantings where you're planting just like one species in a big area in several patches. That is helpful for maintenance, but it's not.
They'll spend 30 minutes having the same.
Oh, Nick, you may have to mute, I think. Yeah, it's helpful for like the folks who are maintaining it, but that when we have a really dry summer, like we have had, then you might have stands that are really dying off. So one of the things that we're looking into, and I'm hearing a lot in our literature that I'm focused on, like ecological, like landscape design, is talking more about matrix planting. So matrix planting does more mimic kind of the historic prairie, in that you have grasses and sedges that are planted in a grid, really, you know, across the planting. And then what that does is to help, we know that forbs are slower to establish than some of our grasses and sedges. And so by having grasses and sedges in a grid, you're really helping to cover the space between the forbs as they get established, so that that open space doesn't get established with, you know, invasive species that you're not looking for. So you're like providing competition by having grasses and sedges in a matrix across the planting, instead of a block planting where, say, your Joe Pye weed has not survived because you had a really dry summer. So what does that look like, you know, and does that more mimic what would be a historic prairie type of ecosystem? And it, you know, there's aesthetic challenges anytime you're designing, there's aesthetics also, but it can also provide like a fairly modern and clean look to a landscape. And that can help also with like aesthetic acceptance of native vegetation. I'm not sure yet if that's the solution, but it's something that, like, when we get the opportunity to do that type of planting in a garden, we're trying to kind of really follow that over time, because of course we need like several years of keeping an eye on that to see how well it's working. And you have, I mean, I'm not the moderator here, so.
No,
Thanks.
no, that's interesting. No, thank you, Jen. That was really interesting. Are there other reactions to that, or other thoughts that came out in your, oh, here, Anne.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been having the same issue in terms of, I'm not with rain gardens. I really don't like using wood chips as the base. I feel like it's causing a lot of weeds to be an issue in gardens, especially those dang volunteer trees. I don't know if it's just feeding them and making them a place where they want to be. It's so easy to establish there. And yeah, I've been trying to figure out, is there a good seed mixture or something of really low growing stuff to grow in between everything else, but then keeping enough sunlight and not too much shade in some of the areas. I've got some trees and shrubs in some of the plantings, and sometimes I just want to tree and shrub up the whole thing, because then I can't see, but then underneath stuff is still coming in, like I'm getting garlic mustard and you know, just irritating invasives coming in. And yeah,
And you muted.
And you went muted at the last part there.
sorry. Yep, I accidentally hit it. It was still there. But just trying to figure out, you know, should we be putting in those various plants, like the matrix, like you said? So are you using not seed, you're using like plugs or bigger plants and doing that matrix? I do think that's probably a good idea, because seed, you know, maybe not enough sunlight, not enough water, but yeah, I don't know. It has been a big issue. I've been trying to figure out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, and I don't want to take up a bunch of time, but I would say that, like, we have not established much with seed and have not had a lot of great success with that. I think that just like making sure that there's the right watering requirements has been really hard.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
these are plants, you know, they may be plugs or, you know, whatever containerized plants. And we are, you know, we do use a lot of mulch in our gardens, especially to get the plants established. I wouldn't say wood chips, because it's definitely not chipped, because that would float, but more like shredded hardwood mulch that's going to mat down and doesn't float. less necessary as the garden gets established, but during the establishment phase, for sure. And we're not establishing those grasses and sedges. We're doing that via plants. So.
That's that just made me think, Jen and Ann, of the aesthetic too of a nice, neat mulched garden. And if we're looking for more coverage and fill in and not that mulchy space in between, I know that aesthetic irritates some people. I think of my next door neighbor in particular, who likes to have a plant here, lots of mulch, another plant here, lots of mulch. So there's a lot of expectation creation. And did any of your groups talk about that? In dealing with the public, we all are doing, a lot of us are doing communication education at work. What kind of conversations do we have, or do we think would maybe be insightful or helpful to have with people when we're talking about native plantings and clean water planting? Angie gave us a lot of ideas. Anything come out in your groups that resonated?
I mean, in our small group, we talked a bit about when we have gardens that there's a contract and the landowner has, said that they're going to take care of it, how people often do for the first couple of years and then kind of gradually don't over time. We also have an example in one of my cities where we created a volunteer-led program, Adopt a Rain Garden, and the volunteer group that we are partnering with kind of went rogue. And it has a lot to do with the expectations, is that, there's a couple of people in the group that have what I consider to be unrealistic expectations, where every single rain garden will be just absolutely perfect and look like it belongs in a conservancy. And so they're taking it upon themselves to, put other people in the community and our organizations to like a higher standard than really what's realistic.
That makes me think too of the idea that if a rain garden or another planting, a shoreline planting, whatever, is fulfilling its intended function, but it doesn't look a certain way, how do we balance that? This is working great, but it doesn't look like what you thought it should. Do you guys anyone run into that? And what are those conversations like? How can we help people? I mean, ultimately, we're hoping to influence a normative change towards a different interpretation of what the landscape around us and our managed landscape looks like, right? So what kind of messaging are we working on, and how's that going over?
I feel like that expectation is such a great thing to explore. These conversations have helped me think about like not just the establishment, but then encouraging people to think of gardens as like living, evolving ecosystems. It's not a stagnant thing we put in that we control and doesn't change over time. It is a living system and it will change. And sometimes it will be really full and beautiful, and sometimes it will look different than that. Just thinking about them as more like dynamic systems rather than, I don't know that we use a ton of that messaging, and I'm curious to talk more with you, Megan, and our communications team about whether that's something we want to share more.
And I was sharing with my group that I've been involved with several older rain gardens that are older now, and my own personal, even though I work in this area, my own personal fear is to what to do with an older garden. Do I take some of these flourishing natives that we put in here, and do I need to divide them? Do I need to cut them? Do I need to move them around? And I'm a little bit afraid to do that. And I think understanding that this is a living, evolving ecosystem, I can actually go ahead and do some of that adjustment that makes sense to me. And it's not the end of the world. It's not like, oh my gosh, I ruined it. Now it's not gonna, I mean, that you can make missteps, other steps, different steps, and they're okay. And you can go from there. I think that permission to try a little bit is something people are afraid to own. Does that make sense?
It's interesting going back to Nick's question about like the big prairie systems, because I mean, prairies change dramatically. It's like you have these huge disturbances, you have fires, you have bison coming through, you have, yeah, just like so much change and disturbance, and they've evolved to actually flourish under that. But like you, Chris, like I'm always like, oh, but like you're a good plant. Like I don't feel like, oh, I know, it's like my logical side is like, there's too much of you. I need to take some of you out. But I'm like, oh, but it's a good plant. I just, it's like hard to get through that mental barrier.
I've also
I-
appreciated
I definitely
Jenna.
do that
Oh,
too.
Anne, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I definitely do that too. And now I'm worried like if I divide a plant and I don't have time to deal with washing off all the roots and not moving worms. Like if I jumping worms, I don't know that we have them or not, and then that's a whole another level. And yeah,
And
like you
that's a
hate to
really
get rid of them.
that's a really good point. I was thinking about the time expectation that we might be thinking that people need to be putting into these things, especially if this is something that's brand new, and how realistic is that for some communities? Again, especially if they're not getting paid. So yeah.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Thoughts on that? Has anyone, I mean, I guess,
I mean, my thing is they probably, I don't know. I'm thinking for me, if I moved into a place that had a rain garden that I didn't ask for, but it's working, I wouldn't do anything. Even if my neighbors think it's ugly, I would tell them to work on it. That's me personally, because it's like, well, it's doing its purpose. But I have heard, and yeah, I think about that with certain situations or neighborhoods, things like that, like the appearance of what a neighborhood, quote unquote, should be like, and kind of like what we're talking about, like what pretty looks like. That's something that I think as a culture we have to reestablish. And I think that we need to have more examples that are maybe funded by either private or public entities that are not private residences. So people can see that on like a scale continuously for years, then they can understand that they have to replicate it. But again, if once it's thriving and somehow somewhat sustainable and maybe just quote unquote low maintenance, but still not looking like what we think. Once we get to that point, I think that's when people will be okay with understanding that one, it doesn't look good, but I don't have to spend it doesn't look good, but I don't have to spend as much time on it. And so maybe just giving those expectations up front of like, hey, in a couple of years, this is what it's gonna look like. And that's just what it is.
it would be interesting. I love your idea of a more public community garden that actually shows that succession of this is going to be, we'll maintain one plot that's newly planted every year, another one that's this old, and it's this old, and just talk about that whole idea of what is, what is good enough, and what is, if not having to put a lot as much effort into something, and it maintains itself and it's doing the job it's created to do, that's good. And so it may not. And so what does my aesthetic, what does my eye see versus what my mind and my life show me? Yeah, there's just a lot in there to ways to help people start visualizing something that is kind of a new concept, a new idea. Could be really fun to do. I'm grateful to Jen for some of the new language. I'm now going to use land care as much as I can. And then then I'm going to be very careful where I throw around the words low maintenance. Thinking clearly about that before I say it. Are there some other thoughts?
I have another thought. I do think in general, and maybe this is just because of I'm a millennial, I don't know, but I think in general, people are leaning towards wanting to do more of these things, especially taking care of plants, but they actually have just kind of like what we were mentioning before, just been removed from what it takes to take care of something that's alive. And so it's kind of like, what does it take to have an innovative thought be part of the mainstream? And I do feel like with time, it, even if I think on a smaller scale like this that we're talking about, I feel like it's kind of like what I forgot who it was who made that comment, Nick. I think that this will be something that people will be more familiar with. And I think I think people really want to do things like this. They just don't know what it entails. And so kind of being educated from that piece slowly over time, we'll see some better results, hopefully.
I love your hopefulness and optimism. I'm with you in that camp too.
Mhm.
I think that's what motivates us and why we get together and share these ideas and inspire each other. I don't know, Anne, how much longer do you want me to, how does this,
Well, yeah, we have about 5 minutes, so happy to continue the conversation if people have more thoughts. Nick raised his hand. Hey, Nick.
I just had this detail that I think fits from our small groups. I was sharing this idea about really conveying the power of doubling up. And I wonder if we kind of tried this as a broad collective, like to say things with volunteers or groups, something like 2 people for 10 minutes is 20 minutes worth of work, and getting people to think about small incremental land care. And that equals, so many hours over the growing season. And maybe it can be more approachable. That's all.
I couldn't find my unmute here. I really like that idea, Nick. I think about it in, the things advice you hear about cleaning your house. If you just pick up a few things here and there, your house is going to be cleaned up. Or if you exercise, if you go out 11 minutes in the morning, 11 minutes at noon, 11 minutes in the late afternoon, that actually accrues to some good exercise. So same thing with our maintenance, just a little bit. I try with my yard. I don't use anything on my yard. I try to go out and say, okay, for 5 minutes, I pull up anything that I think I shouldn't be in there. And oftentimes it stretches into much longer and I have to discipline myself. But I think that kind of approach is a really good idea.
I'm also seeing most of the potential in Eagle Scouts. Any Scout project has more attention. You can kind of shape them into being a little learning experience. You have a training and then you develop their skills and then you let them be a leader. And but then they kind of go their own way, and that's its own issue in Scouts. But I'm getting a lot of Scout requests.
That's an interesting idea, and I'm wondering whether I'm only just barely involved with Scouts, but my oldest is doing her Eagle Scout. But would making a Eagle Scout project that was maintaining something that was already created? I mean, I guess that's probably not a question for this group, but like, would that be inappropriate? Because I feel like otherwise you get, like you said, all of these projects that get started, but not necessarily, they're going to graduate and move on with their lives, or have them develop some kind of maintenance. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't know.
I think same for school projects, because we've, traditionally struggled with those in the past too, that people get really excited about planting the garden on the school property, and there's kind of a one-time funding influx, and then you have teacher turnover and there's parent turnover, and then it just, tends to fall into disrepair over time.
I think, Jen, you're seeing that with Metro Blooms. Don't you have a standing contract with the city of Minneapolis just to address some of those issues a little bit?
Well, I was just gonna say, like, funding for maintenance in general is just really important. So I think that there's traditionally, when I was thinking about like the grant situation that was just mentioned, when funding has been provided, it's really that initial influx to get something going. And then if all of, a number of your watershed districts who provide funding, cities provide funding, just in general, like funding for maintenance, I think I'm starting to see, and it's really glad to see that be kind of like prioritized in general, because I think it provides those resources, and that it's like such a big part of helping gardens be successful, that I think what we really see is that like there needs to be some kind of like funding or resources or support. Like it can't be like, okay, it'd be like you leave the hospital with your baby, you're good to go. Like you would never survive without support from other people. Like, what am I doing? It's like that, you have a new garden baby and you just need some support. And so like making sure there's like resources for support over the course of several years kind of gets your garden established and gets it to be really helpful. And that may look different in different places. That may need to be funding. It may need to be funding to like pay the people who are doing that maintenance. It may need to be resources. It may need to be funding to pay somebody else to do the maintenance. I mean, that could look lots of different things, but just like meeting people where they're at, I think is really, I love talking about maintenance. So I just think it's great to start to think about like, what could we do? What could that look like? So yeah, funding.
Thank you
Well,
all. I
that's
think,
great.
yeah, I think we've hit the end of our time. Next month is going to be our legislative update. So invite everyone to come for that. But thank you for all the great conversation. Thank you, Angie and Jen, for presenting, and Chris for facilitating. This was fantastic. So hope everyone has.
Great ideas. Thanks. Have a lovely day all.
All right. Bye, everyone.